The night my parents announced that my brother Jocko would be the new CEO of our family company, I felt my heart split into two. For years, I had sacrificed my weekends, skipped birthdays, and built the very contracts that kept the company alive. Yet in one moment, my life's work was brushed aside, as if my loyalty meant nothing. But they didn't know one thing. Without me, the foundation of their empire was built on sand. And the storm was already coming. The dinner table was filled with laughter, music, and the smell of expensive food. Everyone thought it was a night to celebrate the future of the family company. Fenu sat quietly, smiling, believing her parents were finally going to reward her for the years she had worked day and night. She had built contracts, brought in investors, and kept the company strong when things almost collapsed. Deep inside, she thought tonight would be her moment. Then her father stood up, lifted his glass, and proudly announced that Jocko, her younger brother, would be the new CEO. The words cut through her chest like a blade. For a moment, she could not breathe. Around the table, people clapped, some cheered, but the sound felt like thunder in her ears. She stared at her parents, waiting for them to say her name, waiting for them to explain. But they didn't. Jocko leaned back in his chair with a grin, full of pride. He acted as if this had been his right all along, as if he had been working for it in silence. Fenu watched the smug smile on his face and suddenly understood. He had known all along. He had sat through her endless nights of work, her sacrifices, her skipped vacations, only to quietly wait for the crown to fall on his head. Her hands trembled under the table. She thought of the years she gave up, the friendships she lost, the moments she traded just to prove herself to the family. Yet none of it mattered now. Not one thank you. Not one word of recognition. Her parents looked at Jocko like he was a gift. While she sat there invisible, her throat tightened as Jocko raised his glass, giving a little speech about how he would take the company to new heights. Every word felt like a mockery. Every sentence a reminder that her sacrifices were stolen. She forced herself to swallow her pain and sit still, even when she wanted to scream. In that moment, Fenu's heart broke. The betrayal was not just the choice, but the way her family celebrated it without hesitation, without shame. They had erased her years of loyalty with a single announcement, and Jocko's smile told her this was only the beginning of her heartbreak. Fenu sat frozen after the announcement, but inside her mind, memories began to pour in like waves she couldn't stop. She remembered the countless nights she sat in a cold office, staring at contracts long after everyone had gone home. While her friends went out to parties, weddings, and birthdays, she was alone, sending emails and fixing mistakes to keep the company alive. She remembered how she would carry files to bed, falling asleep with her laptop on her chest, only to wake up before sunrise and start again. She thought of the weekends she gave away. When others rested, she was traveling on last-minute flights to meet clients in distant cities. She endured sleepless nights in hotels, dealing with investors who doubted the company's strength. It was her voice that convinced them to stay. It was her persistence that sealed deals when others had given up. Yet her name was never mentioned. The credit always went to the company, never to her. Her chest tightened as she remembered moments that cut deeper. Like the time she skipped her best friend's wedding because she had to fly out to finalize a contract. Or the time she missed her own birthday dinner because a client demanded last-minute negotiations. She never complained. She told herself it was worth it. That one day, her parents would see her sacrifices, her loyalty, her hard work. She believed they would look at her with pride and say, "You built this with your own hands." But that moment never came. Instead, she sat at the dinner table, listening to her parents praise Jocko. Her father spoke about his potential. Her mother smiled about his bright future. And not once did their eyes even turn to her. Fenu felt invisible, as though the years she gave had vanished like smoke. She remembered her mother once telling her, "Fenu, family always comes first. You must give everything to protect our name." And she did. She gave her time, her youth, even her happiness. But now, as she watched her brother soak in the glory she had earned, she realized her parents never meant her. Family came first, but not her. The more she remembered, the more painful it became. Every late night, every lonely flight, every moment she chose duty over joy, it all meant nothing. Her sacrifices had been ignored, buried under favoritism and blindness. And as Jocko smiled proudly at the table, Fenu felt the sharp truth. She had given them everything, and they had given her nothing. Fenu sat at the table, her fork untouched, her eyes fixed on the smiling faces around her. Her parents laughed as they toasted Jocko, their proud new CEO. Relatives clapped, glasses clinked, and the room buzzed with excitement. But to Fenu it all felt distant, like she was no longer part of this family. Her chest was heavy, her hands cold, but she kept her face calm. She did not argue. She did not shout. She simply sat in silence, swallowing the ache in her throat. Everyone expected her to speak up, to challenge the decision, to defend her years of sacrifice. But instead, she gently placed her napkin on the table, pushed back her chair, and stood up. The sound of her chair scraping against the floor was louder than the clapping. The room grew quiet for a moment, eyes turning toward her, waiting for an outburst. But none came. Fenu didn't look at anyone. She didn't beg for recognition or ask for an explanation. She simply walked away from the long table, her steps steady, her back straight. Her silence shocked everyone more than any words could have. Her parents exchanged quick glances, confused and uneasy, while Jocko smirked and raised his glass even higher. As she walked out of the dining hall, Jocko's laugh followed her. He thought her silence was weakness. He thought she had finally given up, surrendering the crown he believed belonged to him. To him, her quiet exit was proof that he had won the battle. His grin widened as he leaned back in his chair, soaking in the praise and attention that should have been hers. But what Jocko and her parents failed to see was the fire burning inside her. Her silence was not defeat, it was power. She knew that words spoken in anger would only be dismissed, just like her sacrifices had been dismissed. But silence? Silence carried weight. It left questions hanging in the air. It made people uneasy. It planted doubt. Fenu's exit was not a retreat. It was the beginning of something none of them expected. She was done begging for a place at a table that refused to see her worth. She was done proving herself to people who had already chosen blindness. Her silence was a promise that she would rise but not under their shadow. As the doors closed behind her, Jocko laughed louder, believing he had crushed her spirit. But if he had looked closer, he would have seen it. The calm before the storm. Fenu's silence was not the end of her story. It was the start of a storm that would shake everything they thought was secure. Days passed after the dinner, but the silence Fenu left behind still lingered. At the company headquarters, everyone pretended things were normal, yet tension spread like smoke in the air. Jocko wore his new title with pride, sitting in the CEO's chair as if it had been waiting for him all his life. He spoke loudly in meetings, gave out orders, and carried himself like a king. But beneath his confidence was a nervousness he tried to hide. He had never built a single contract on his own, and now he was faced with his first true test. The company's biggest partner, a foreign investor who had trusted them for years, was ready to renew a $600,000 contract. This deal was not just another paper to sign, it was the lifeline of the company. Without it, half of their projects would collapse, and many employees would lose their jobs. Jocko smiled and assured his parents that he could handle it. He walked into the negotiation room with his usual arrogance, thinking his title was enough to win respect. But the investor was firm. He had seen the company struggle in the past and knew exactly who had kept it alive. He remembered the long calls, the detailed explanations, the endless patience that had made every deal possible. It was always Fenu. She was the one who convinced him to stay when competitors tried to pull him away. She was the one who delivered on promises when the company almost failed. And so, when the papers were placed in front of him, he pushed them back and said clearly, "This contract will only be signed if Fenu is part of the deal." The words fell like a heavy stone in the room. Jocko's smile froze, his palms grew sweaty. He tried to laugh it off, insisting he could handle everything himself. But the investor shook his head. He had no faith in empty words or shiny titles. His loyalty was not to the family name, but to the person who had earned his trust. When Jocko returned to his parents, panic filled his voice. He told them about the condition, hoping they would finally admit they had made a mistake. But instead, pride blinded them once again. His father raised his hand and said, "You are the CEO now. You must prove yourself. Fenu is no longer needed." His mother agreed, saying that bringing her back would make Jocko look weak. Jocko nodded, but fear burned inside him. He knew he could not deliver what Fenu had done for years. He knew the investor's trust was slipping through his fingers. Yet his parents' stubborn pride left him trapped. They had chosen their son over their daughter. And now the very empire they tried to protect was beginning to shake. And somewhere far from them, Fenu remained silent, unaware that her absence was already testing the strength of everything they thought they controlled. The weeks that followed turned into a nightmare for Jocko. At first, he walked into the office with his shoulders high, acting as though everything was under control. He bragged to employees, telling them the investor would eventually bend and sign. But behind closed doors, nothing was going as planned. The deadlines for the $600,000 contract grew closer, and instead of securing progress, Jocko kept making mistake after mistake. He scheduled important meetings on the wrong days, leaving investors waiting and angry. He promised results he couldn't deliver, and ignored the small details that kept deals alive. Where Fenu used to carefully prepare, research, and follow through, Jocko relied only on charm and arrogance. He believed his title as CEO was enough to win respect, but every time he spoke, his lack of knowledge showed. The investors grew restless, whispering doubts about the company's future. One afternoon, during a crucial meeting, Jocko lost his temper. The investor raised concerns about late reports and missing documents. Instead of listening and finding solutions, Jocko snapped. He accused the investor of being too demanding, of not trusting him, and even suggested that if they were unhappy, they could walk away. The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking deep. The investor, who had once been patient because of Fenu's professionalism, now looked offended and cold. News of the argument spread quickly through the company. Employees whispered in hallways, sharing stories of how Jocko barked orders without understanding what he was asking for. Some projects stalled completely because he refused to ask for help, believing it would make him look weak. His arrogance was no longer confidence. It was chaos. Departments that once worked smoothly under Fenu's quiet guidance now struggled under Jocko's careless leadership. As the final deadline loomed, the truth became clear. The investor refused to sign the deal without Fenu's involvement, and Jocko had done nothing to change his mind. Instead, he had pushed him further away. The company, which had once looked stable and strong, began to crack at its foundation. Meetings with other clients became tense, smaller investors pulled back, and trust in the company slipped through their fingers. At home, his parents tried to reassure him, saying he just needed time to adjust. But even they could see the worry in his eyes. Jocko's confidence was slipping, and for the first time he realized the position he had stolen came with a weight he could not carry. The once celebrated new CEO was no longer a symbol of pride. He was now a sign of failure, and everyone around him was beginning to see it. The collapse had begun, and with every passing day, it became harder to hide the truth. Jocko was not a leader. He was a shadow of the person who had built the empire. And without Fenu, the company was standing on broken ground. The collapse of the company became impossible to hide. Employees were leaving, projects were stuck, and the once loyal investors were pulling away. The $600,000 contract slipped through their hands, and smaller deals followed behind. The empire that had taken decades to build was falling apart in weeks. For the first time, Jocko stopped smiling. He avoided calls, hid behind excuses, and even his parents began to see the truth. Their proud decision had backfired. At night, the house was no longer filled with celebration. The same parents who had raised glasses for Jocko now sat in silence, their faces heavy with regret. The company accounts were shrinking, debts were rising, and creditors were circling like vultures. Rumors spread in the business world that the family's empire was on its last breath. And in every whisper, one name came up: Fenu. Everyone knew she had been the backbone, the reason the company had survived for so long. Finally, pride gave way to desperation. One evening, her parents drove to her apartment. For years, they had dismissed her sacrifices, ignored her pain, and chosen her brother over her. Now they stood at her door, faces pale, voices soft, no longer the powerful figures they used to be. Her mother was the first to speak, her tone shaky as she said, "Fenu, we need you. The company cannot survive without you." Her father added, "You know how to fix this. You always have. Please come back." Their words were heavy with desperation, their eyes pleading for mercy. Fenu listened quietly, her heart steady. Once, she would have rushed in without thinking, ready to carry their weight on her shoulders, ready to save the empire that never saved her. But not this time. She remembered every sleepless night, every lonely flight, every moment they ignored her worth. She remembered the betrayal at the dinner table, the way they celebrated Jocko, while she sat invisible. That wound was still fresh, and their sudden cries for help could not erase it. She looked at them with calm eyes, not anger, but not softness either. "You didn't need me then," she said slowly. "Why do you need me now?" The silence after her words stung more than any shout. Her parents shifted uncomfortably, unable to answer. This time, Fenu did not rush to fix their mistakes. She did not bend to their desperation. Instead, she closed the door gently, leaving them outside with their crumbling empire. For the first time, she chose herself over them. She chose peace over sacrifice. And as her parents walked away with heavy steps, they finally realized the cost of pushing away the one person who had truly held everything together. Their empire was falling, and without Fenu, there was no one left to save it. After closing the door on her parents, Fenu sat alone in her apartment, but for the first time in years, she felt free. The weight of carrying her family's empire was gone. The pain of betrayal was still there, but instead of breaking her, it gave her a new strength. She realized she had spent her whole life proving her worth to people who refused to see it. Now she would build something that belonged only to her. She began quietly, with nothing but her savings and the knowledge she had gained from years of sacrifice. Every skill, every sleepless night, every lesson she had learned in silence, she now used for herself. She worked long hours, but this time it felt different. She wasn't a shadow behind her brother. She wasn't invisible at a table where no one clapped for her. This time she was building her own name, her own path. Word spread quickly in the business world. People who once worked with her family's company began to notice her absence. Investors who had grown frustrated with Jocko's arrogance remembered the calm, reliable woman who had always delivered. Slowly, they reached out to her. Meetings that once drained her spirit now filled her with energy because she was negotiating for her own dream. She spoke with honesty, offered transparency, and treated every client with respect. The very investors her family had lost now started signing contracts with her. One by one, they shifted their trust from the crumbling empire to Fenu's new beginning. They didn't just see her as a businesswoman. They saw her as someone who valued loyalty and truth above pride. In an industry full of greed and betrayal, her sincerity stood out like light in the dark. Her company grew faster than she had ever imagined. Employees who had felt suffocated under Jocko's leadership left and came to join her. They wanted to work with someone who inspired them, someone who valued their effort. Her office, though smaller at first, was filled with energy, vision, and hope. What her parents and brothers saw as weakness, her humility and quiet strength, turned out to be the very reason for her success. As weeks turned into months, Fenu's company became the rising star of the industry. Investors who once sat at her family's table now praised her for her brilliance. The empire that had cast her aside was fading into shadows, while her new path grew brighter every day. For the first time, Fenu felt she was where she truly belonged, not begging for recognition, not fighting for scraps of respect, but standing tall as the creator of her own destiny. She had turned her pain into power, and in doing so, she built a foundation stronger than anything her family had ever imagined. The cracks in the company widened until they could no longer be hidden. Jocko, once celebrated as the young and bold CEO, was now drowning in problems he could not control. Investors who had once politely listened to him began to cut ties. Contracts that were supposed to secure the company's future slipped away one after another. Every failure landed on his desk, and every headline in the business world had his name tied to it. The pressure weighed heavily on him. Newspapers began to write stories about the collapse of the once great empire. Whispers spread through boardrooms and conferences that Jocko had no real skill, that he had only taken a seat built by someone else's hard work. Employees, tired of his arrogance and careless leadership, started leaving in waves. Departments that once ran smoothly now stood half empty, and the offices that used to hum with energy were filled with tension and fear. Then came the scandals. Decisions Jocko made without thought backfired in public. Deals that he rushed to secure without proper planning ended in lawsuits. His reckless words to partners found their way into the press, painting him as rude and irresponsible. Each mistake brought humiliation, and with each day, His image as the proud CEO crumbled. The financial losses piled up quickly. Without the $600,000 contract, the company's budget shrank, and without new investors, debts grew larger. Projects were abandoned halfway, suppliers refused to deliver, and employees went unpaid. The empire his parents once bragged about was no longer a symbol of strength, but a warning to others about pride and poor leadership. Jocko tried to hide his fear behind false confidence, but it no longer worked. In private, he snapped at his parents, blaming them for the pressure. In meetings, he shouted at his staff, trying to mask his panic with anger. But no matter how loud he was, the truth was clear. He was losing control. And then came the moment that shattered him completely. At a major business conference, where once he would have been welcomed with applause, he was ignored. Investors who once smiled at him walked past him to greet Fenu, who now stood tall with her own thriving company. He watched as they praised her honesty, her loyalty, and her vision, the very qualities he never valued. In that moment, Jocko finally understood. The empire could not stand without her. She had been the backbone all along, the reason for its survival. Without her guidance, his title was empty, his power meaningless. The ego he once carried so proudly was now in pieces. For the first time in his life, Jocko realized what it felt like to be truly powerless. His downfall was not just public, it was personal. He had lost the respect of others, and worse, he had lost the chance to ever earn it again. The house that once stood proud now felt like it was sinking in silence. The parents called Fenu home, not with authority as they once did, but with trembling voices that carried defeat. She entered and found them waiting in the living room, their faces pale, their eyes tired. For the first time in her life, her father did not look powerful, and her mother did not wear pride. They looked broken. The empire they once protected with arrogance was collapsing, and with it, their confidence. Her father began first, his voice heavy. "Fenu, we were wrong." The words came slow, like stones dragged out of the ground. He admitted that when they had chosen Jocko over her, it wasn't because she lacked ability. It was because they thought a son would protect the family name better than a daughter. They had been blinded by tradition, by favoritism, by pride. They confessed that they saw her as someone strong enough to stand alone, while Jocko was treated as fragile and in need of protection. But in doing so, they had underestimated her worth and overestimated his strength. Her mother's eyes filled with tears as she spoke next. "We failed you, Fenu. You carried the weight of this family in silence for years, and we never said thank you. We pushed you aside when you should have been leading. And now, everything we built is burning because we refused to see you clearly." Her hands shook as she reached for Fenu, but Fenu stayed still, her face unreadable. The confession did not stop there. They admitted that the investors had lost trust in them, that employees were resigning one after another, and that their reputation in the business world had shattered. Everything they once dismissed as unimportant, honesty, relationships, loyalty, were exactly the things Fenu had given freely, but they had ignored. Now they saw her as the only one who could restore what had been lost. The room grew heavier as their words spilled out, words Fenu had waited her whole life to hear. She saw her father's shoulders tremble as he lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. She saw her mother's tears run without shame, a sight she never imagined possible. For a brief moment, it felt as if justice had finally arrived, not in revenge, but in truth. But Fenu's heart had changed. She remembered every night she worked late, trying to prove herself. She remembered every time they dismissed her ideas, praised Jocko, and made her feel like she did not belong. She remembered standing alone when the family she sacrificed for treated her as nothing. Their tears were real, but her wounds were deeper. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and unshaken. "I hear your words. I accept your truth, but I cannot carry this family anymore." The silence that followed cut deeper than anger ever could. They had finally confessed what she always knew, but it was too late to undo the lessons she had learned. That Fenu's empire kept rising higher each day. What once began with her quiet determination was now a strong, shining company admired by many. Investors trusted her. Employees followed her with loyalty. Clients spoke of her honesty and brilliance. Everywhere, her name was connected to respect and growth. Meanwhile, the family's company that once pushed her away kept sinking. Without her guidance, their contracts collapsed, investors pulled back, and workers lost faith. The same empire they thought was too big to fail was now crumbling before everyone's eyes. One evening, Fenu stood on a grand stage at a business conference. Cameras flashed, the audience applauded, and her name was announced as one of the most successful business leaders of the year. She held her speech card in her hand, but she didn't need it. She looked into the crowd, not searching for her parents' faces, not for Jocko, not for approval. She stood tall because she had finally learned that her worth was never meant to be measured by their acceptance. As she spoke, she told her story, not as a victim, but as someone who turned pain into power. She shared how walking away gave her space to grow. Her words were calm, full of dignity, and they touched every heart in the room. Many nodded, some even had tears in their eyes. But in the crowd, her family sat quietly, watching the daughter they once ignored rise higher than they ever imagined. They had no words, no defense, only regret. When the applause filled the hall, Fenu took a deep breath. She didn't smile with pride or anger. Instead, she let a soft, knowing expression rest on her face. She whispered to herself, too quietly for anyone else to hear. Sometimes walking away is the loudest victory of all. And in that moment it was clear, her triumph wasn't about revenge. It was about freedom, dignity, and the strength of knowing her value. She no longer needed their approval. Her success stood as proof that she had already won.